Is my screen sharing?
Your slides? No.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Jensen. I am the Education Director for the Arizona Housing Coalition. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar on zoning, aging, and health. We have a lot of our coalition members with us today, but if you are not familiar with the Arizona Housing Coalition, we are a statewide network of about 200 organizations, all working together toward a shared mission of ending homelessness and advocating for affordable housing for each and every one of our Arizona residents. We do education, which today is one example of. We do advocacy, and we do a lot of coordinating work to make sure that all of us throughout the state who are doing this type of work are moving together in tandem. One of the upcoming signature events that we have is our annual conference coming up at the end of the month. And I bring that up because we are going to continue talking about zoning at our conference, and it's available for registration until the end of this week. So just to give you a little advertising, and I'll come back to this at the end, we have two guest speakers coming to the conference, Nolan Gray, who wrote the book called Arbitrary Lines, which is a zoning primer, very easy to read, very easy to understand, and sets out the whole foundation for the history of zoning and some suggestions for where it should go. And our other keynote speaker at the conference will be Anise Parker, who is the former mayor of Houston. Houston has done some incredible things with solving their homelessness issues. And also, Houston is one of those cities that does not have zoning. So it's an interesting example for us at the conference to talk about what does it look like when a city does not have zoning in place. So again, registration for our conference is open until the end of the week, and you'll be seeing more in the chat, a couple of links, not only in the chat, but in my follow-up email, so that if you're interested and would like to be part of that conference conversation, you can still get registered. With that, I would like to turn this webinar over to two other zoning experts. We have Kirin Goff and Slade Smith, both of whom are from the University of Arizona Applied Health Policy Institute. And they will be leading us through the webinar. I am going off camera, but I will be in the background paying attention to any questions that come up in the chat. And then I will appear back on screen to help navigate those questions. With that, I turn it over to Kirin.
Thank you so much for having us. We're thrilled that so many people are interested in learning more about this topic. And it's very timely because the last I checked, the Senate Commerce Committee was still voting on a piece of statewide zoning legislation. So we'll have to see what happens. So the format will be, the presentation itself is about 50 minutes. And we'll have a couple of questions as we go, and then the majority of questions at the end. And then the Q&A will sort of turn into an informal discussion where anybody who wants to chat some more or talk to us independently can stay. So we would like to introduce you to two of my favorite humans to start us off. These are my boyfriend's grandparents, Rose and Mike. And they're doing well, but they would like to get out more, especially since COVID. And we were lucky enough that they came to visit us for a couple of weeks recently. And we all had such a wonderful time, and I found their experience kind of inspiring and tying into zoning law, so I thought I'd share it. They lit up while they were here. Grandma, in her words, had a renewed pep in her step. And some of that was the excitement of vacation and being together with family, but they really loved the neighborhood that we live in. And we have a big window looking out onto 40th Street where there's lots of things going on in the community. And, there's always kids and dogs walking by. Grandpa played racquetball with me and fixed things around the house. And on Sundays, Grandma usually watches Zoom from the couch in her living room. But there happens to be a church that's just a stone's throw from my house. So on Sunday, I walked with her over to it so that she could go in person. And Grandpa goes on a walk every morning and had a lovely time exploring. And he went to a park, he went to a coffee shop. One day he went on 3 walks in one day. And this walking was actually a big deal. And my neighborhood is not actually all that walkable in absolute terms, but the ways that it is made a really big difference. So one day he was walking and saw a house that looked affordable. And they're thinking about moving, and he was excited about the possibility of moving to somewhere that is a great neighborhood close to family. So he actually picked up the phone and called a realtor for a for sale sign. And how much do you think a house like this would cost? He was shocked to find out that it was over $600,000. This is not Palo Alto or New York City. It's a nice neighborhood, but this is Central Phoenix. Well, it turns out that there's a lot of other people who share Rose and Mike's frustrations about being able to find housing that's a good fit for them in a neighborhood that they like. And his grandparents are doing well overall, but this is a serious problem for a lot of people. And our elderly population, by and large, has a lower quality of life than they might if we had a better environment.
And let's face it, Rose and Mike are lucky. Many seniors have it way worse. Skyrocketing housing prices here have helped cause a 38% increase in senior homelessness in Maricopa County just last year. And many who still have homes live in communities that socially isolate them and discourage active lifestyles. Consider the last statistic on this slide. 87% of seniors don't meet federal exercise guidelines. They aren't getting enough activity. And the other stats add up to a picture of social isolation and loneliness for seniors. Now, individual studies are imperfect, but when we take this kind of research together, it shows that far too many of our seniors live sedentary and socially isolated lives. And our car-centric communities can be particularly isolating for the many seniors who can't drive. They can't easily access their communities. And almost a quarter of those no longer driving reported that they had not visited family or friends in the past month. Even worse, seniors who are inactive or isolated tend to lose their physical and mental capabilities at a much higher rate. And that dooms them to inactivity and isolation for the rest of their lives.
And we know that sedentary, isolated lives lead to an array of debilitating chronic conditions like diabetes, heart disease, depression, dementia. The list goes on. And many of these have a very strong connection to these types of lifestyle risk factors. And studies of older people indicate that social isolation increases dementia risk by 50%. So this is a very large magnitude that we're talking about. People are more depressed if limited transportation prevents them from socializing. And people who don't leave their house very often die younger. But this is not inevitable. We could have way longer health spans. And we know from anthropological studies that some populations have a much lower prevalence and higher age of onset of these types of diseases. And that lots of people in other places, elderly populations are much more present and participating in public life. For example, in the Netherlands and Germany, it's very common to see elderly people riding around on bicycles. And in China, it's common to see elderly people sitting on the street playing games like the picture on the right, or doing Tai Chi in a park. So our challenge is to figure out how we can create cities that facilitate longer, healthier, happier lives. And it turns out that zoning changes can make a real difference at that. The built environment drives our behavior. this is the physical parts of the spaces where we live, things like buildings, parks, and roads. And as Jordan's grandparents experienced, the built environment can dictate how appealing or cumbersome an activity it is, or whether it's possible to go somewhere at all. And this experience is common, and it dictates everybody's behavior of any age. It's just more impactful for some populations. So it turns out that walkable neighborhoods actually cause people to walk more. For example, one study asked people a series of questions about how much they wanted to live in a neighborhood with various walkable features. And they looked at the type of neighborhood that those people actually lived in and how much they walked. And they found that there were actually a lot of people who lived in a more auto-centric environment, but they wished that they lived in a walkable environment. And those people actually walked less than people who lived in walkable neighborhoods.
And even people who don't value walkability walk twice as much when they live in walkable neighborhoods.
So the opportunity here is that there are tons of people who would walk more and receive all of the health benefits and autonomy and transportation if we had enough affordable, walkable housing, but we don't. There's a mismatch between supply and demand, which is largely why we have high housing costs in walkable neighborhoods, as Grandpa Mike experienced. So when realtors have done market research, we found that around, not we, I'm not a realtor, around 60% of people, including 54% of baby boomers, want to live in a walkable urban environment. And this number has increased over time. But the vast majority of our supply is single family homes in car-dependent places. In most major cities, about 75% of land is zoned for single family homes. So why do we have this mismatch of supply and demand? Why is the market not just adjusting to meet the demand? Well, it turns out that this auto-centric design is actually required by law through zoning. We're gonna pick on Phoenix a little bit because that's where I live, and we're gonna talk about some examples from Phoenix. But this is the case in almost all major cities throughout the United States. So Phoenix is in no way unique in this regard.
So when we're talking about zoning laws, we're simply talking about municipal laws that govern how land can be used and developed. Each municipality adopts a zoning code, and in Arizona and many other states, there's a state law that authorizes municipalities to enact these codes. And these establish certain things that the municipal codes must and must not do. So zoning typically creates categories of land use like commercial, residential, and so forth, and then subcategories within those categories that have different densities and attributes. Phoenix, for example, has dozens of subcategories. There's commercial zones for different types of businesses and several different densities of residential, for example. And then the zones are mapped out under the whole city. Typically when the city annexes land, some default zone type will apply. And then when a developer wants to build something on the land that the current zone disallows, there's a rezoning process for that developer to apply for an appropriate category.
So the requirements of zoning codes are very, very detailed. They include big things like the number of stories that a building can be, but also small things like where you have to place a planter or an awning. These are, for example, some excerpts of provisions from Phoenix's zoning code, which is more than 1,200 pages long, which is typical. So when you walk around, when you drive around and all the buildings look the same, these are not organic choices. Much of this style of development is required. And a lot of it might seem benign or trivial or even helpful. I know very few people, for example, who would dispute that having handicapped parking spots are beneficial. But when we dictate this much detail of what our spaces can look like, we limit our ability to adapt to changing needs and to innovate new ways of building and doing things. And we lock ourselves into some unintended consequences.
So the details matter. And so here's a picture of Cave Creek Golf Course's parking lot. Now Kirin doesn't like golf courses, but I'm a golfer, so I like golf courses. And this next picture is a picture of the same parking lot from a satellite. There is 240 parking spots here. And this is literally acres of excess parking on most days. So why so much? Well, zoning requires it. So you can add it up. Two spaces per hole are required by zoning, one pace per group per hour. That tees off, 2 spaces per driving range station, 1 space per 50 square feet of indoor and outdoor dining area, 1 space per 300 square feet of retail space, and on and on. And then, this all adds up to a very, very large parking lot. Now, one golf course, probably not a big deal, but zoning requires many of the over 12 million parking spaces in the Phoenix metro area. That number comes from a 2017 estimate, so it's probably more today. And that 2017 study estimated that there's about 100 square miles of parking in the metro area, or about 10% of the total metro land area, just parking. And all that pavement is a problem. It's a major contributor to Phoenix's urban heat island effect, which is increasingly deadly. More than 10 times as many heat-associated deaths occur in a typical year in Maricopa County now than just 2 decades ago. And the elderly are particularly vulnerable. People 75 and older are in Maricopa County have the highest rate of heat-associated death of any age group. And many people in this age group die every year in their homes from the heat just because their AC isn't working. If we had just 10% less surface parking area in the metro, it would likely save lives. And that's how I think we need to think about zoning.
As he illustrated, a single rule can have significant consequences. But taken together, these zoning ordinances necessitate a pattern of 2 rather unsurprising lifestyle features: that most people live in a single family home and that most people drive a car. And there's lots of requirements that work together to make this happen. But we're going to take a closer look at each one, starting with housing. Looking at the housing market as a whole, zoning influences not just the decisions of individual consumers, but the cost and overall supply of housing. And it does so in a few ways. First, most obviously, we limit where we can build. So if only a small percentage of land is zoned multifamily, then there's less housing units that can be built. Likewise, there's zones that there can't be any housing at all. For example, empty brick and mortar retail spaces that can't be revamped as housing. But even within any given residential zone, we have requirements that drive up the unit and lot size. And these are things like minimum lot sizes, usually around 5,000 square feet for a single family house, minimum square footage, maximum percentage of the lot that can be taken up by the house, setbacks. And the impact of this is that we end up with making it illegal to have small houses or to not have a yard in many places. And each space ends up taking up more land than demand might otherwise require. And we have similar rules for multifamily housing. It's worded a little bit more confusing. It's things like you can only have 1 unit for every X number of square feet in a building, for example. But it has the same effect of driving up the size of individual units, which force buyers to purchase more house than they wanted, and also lower the overall supply, which drives houses up. There's also features for all housing types that zoning codes often require, which forces buyers to pay for features that they might not otherwise want or want to pay for. things like parking or kitchen facilities, for example. This is a diagram that Nolan Gray included in his book from a Portland ordinance outlining what these requirements look like visually for a single family home. And then this, I think, is an interesting graphic because if you look at the left, this is a 2-bedroom apartment that's 675 square feet. And then on the right is if we required 2 parking spots per unit, the amount of space that the required parking takes up, and it's almost the same amount of space. So just having that parking requirement almost doubles the amount of land that a 2-bedroom apartment would take up. So zoning has a complex history, but it spread in conjunction with some of the cultural norms and values of the time that it grew. And one of those that's particularly relevant for single family housing is the nuclear family. And I just wanted to point out a section I highlighted from Nolan Gray's book of the little family on the lawn, illustrating that the nuclear family ideal is actually embedded into, you can see how it plays out as the diagram explains the requirements.
So obviously a lot of single family housing was created during the baby boom when there was a lot of nuclear families with children. They needed or wanted bigger homes and liked the big yards where their children could play. Houses and land was less expensive, and the good economies in the post-war period made these homes affordable for many people. The single-family homes used a lot of land, but like I say, the land was cheap. Yeah, the neighborhoods were sprawling, but that wasn't a big deal because the middle class could now afford cars. Gas was cheap, a few pennies a gallon. Traffic wasn't as bad because there wasn't as many people back then. It wasn't a big deal that sprawl required a lot of paved streets and parking lots at the time because nobody had heard of global warming or urban heat islands. The minimum lot sizes, minimum house sizes, and single family occupancy requirements were seen as positives because they tended to ensure that a person's neighbors had income or wealth and wouldn't steal from them. People believed that it made it more likely that their neighbors would share their values, that social harms like crime would be less common, and that their neighborhoods would be safe places to raise their children, to be good schools, and so on and so forth. These neighborhoods in many cities were seen as havens by middle-class whites, havens from the racial strife in city cores. And middle-class whites tended to forcefully resist projects that involved rezoning to denser housing types because they feared that racial and ethnic minorities would move in and cause the same problems that they were fleeing in the city cores. So the baby boom ended, but we still tended to build sprawling neighborhoods after that. And there was a few reasons for that. One was that single family homes over the years can be seen as an investment, the home itself as a vehicle to build wealth. And people bought more home to try to build more wealth. Also, building the bigger, higher cost homes aligned with the interests of developers because they tended to be more profitable. But another reason that this persisted was that municipalities had an interest in these building more of these single family neighborhoods because it meant more revenue from property taxes per capita. And at the same time, the wealthy people that tended to move into these houses, they tended to need less social support. So it made it easy for the municipalities to have all this single family housing. Now, later, Kirin's going to mention the need for zoning reform at the state level, and this kind of gets to why that is needed. Municipalities have every incentive to make affordable housing somebody else's problem. So unless the state steps in, that's what they're going to tend to do. There's a famous the Supreme Court case in the 1970s involving Arlington Heights, a Chicago suburb. And Arlington Heights was all single family residential, big houses, big lots. It was a classic white flight suburb, about 65,000 people there, and only 27 of them were Black in the 1970 census, even though Chicago Metro was about 20% Black people. So a developer comes into Arlington Heights and wants to build a affordable townhome project there, and they want to rezone their parcel to allow it. There's vehement opposition in the community. It'll ruin the character of our neighborhood. Our schools will become war zones just like Chicago's. And the zoning board was like, well, we don't want this headache. So they turned down the project. The developer challenged it, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Arlington Heights. They said that even if your zoning decision causes severe racial segregation, that's constitutional as long as your main intent is doing something like maintaining the character of your neighborhood as a suburban, haven, and not racial discrimination. So I think the takeaway should be that there's nothing stopping municipalities from trying their hardest through zoning to make big social problems like a lack of affordable housing someone else's problem. And that's why the state may need to step in. So all this single family zoning that we have doesn't just regulate stuff like lot sizes and the size of houses. It also regulates who can live in those houses. Here's Phoenix's zoning law restricting who can live in a single family household.
We doubt that they are actively enforcing this in 2023, but it's a great example, much like the little diagram from the Portland ordinance, of how these family ideals are embedded into the law. It's good historical context.
But I bet that there's somebody in our audience that is actually breaking this law. So it's defining a family as either a group of related people, or, and if you read that second provision there, a group of not more than 5 persons who need not be related, living together as a single housekeeping unit in a dwelling unit. And so what that complicated provision is saying is that any number of people can live together as long as they are all related. But if any member of a household is unrelated, the household group is limited to 5 people. So in other words, if you have a family of 5 people living together and you know somebody who's hard on their luck and you invite them into your household, you're violating that second provision there. Now, there are constitutional reasons for laws like this. In particular, there's 2 Supreme Court cases in the 1970s. The first one said that the government generally can't prohibit related people from living together. Now, there's exceptions to this. It's apparently constitutional for to have retirement communities, for example. But in general, the government can't prohibit you from living with your relatives. In the second case, the government said that municipalities could restrict households of unrelated people. So Phoenix is basically just doing what the Constitution allows in terms of limiting household composition.
It's not really clear where seniors fit in to this nuclear family ideal. I only have so many examples from my own family, so meet Granny. And she might live in a single person or a 2-person household where this idea of the nuclear family in this big house in the suburbs doesn't really meet her needs. Maybe it's more than she can afford, or maybe she has her house paid off, but it's still a lot of time and money spent on things like maintenance and equity that she could get back if she sold it and moved somewhere else. And as you'll see, we don't have a lot of housing supply that is outside of this nuclear family ideal. And our elderly population is only increasing. As a concept, you might think that the nuclear family is a wonderful ideal, or maybe you think it's a misguided construction. But the reality is that to the extent that it ever did exist, our demographics don't match that nuclear family template now. 30% of households in the US have only one person. And by 2025, it's estimated that about 80% of households won't have children. And about a third of the population is either too young, too old, or has a disability that prevents them from driving, which makes these car-centric suburbs not necessarily meet their needs. To be fair, in the last 10 years or so, most cities have done a better job of building housing that looks like this. Because we've recognized the need for more density, we've changed some zoning, developers have figured out how to make apartment buildings profitable, and that's great. And that meets the needs of more people, but it's still not for everyone, including a lot of seniors. For one thing, it still creates a very binary choice in terms of the size and features of a unit. For example, Grandma Rose told me that even though they didn't need a big house with a big yard, she didn't really want to be boxed into an apartment. And you have to share walls with people. They're oftentimes high density housing is in large buildings that are gated and maybe have kind of a generic or impersonal feel. The long walk to the street and a hassle to get mail and groceries. And a lot of people don't mind those things, and that's wonderful. I've lived in big apartment buildings and loved it, but we just don't have quite enough choices. Another issue is the location. Multifamily zones have long been commonly used as a buffer to buffer single-family housing zones from less desirable areas. So the best neighborhoods, the places that are along side streets next to schools and parks, are overwhelmingly zoned single family. So if we really want to not just increase our housing supply, but do it in a way that gives people optimum flexibility and choices, we're gonna have to do some of that by adding more variety to single family home zones. So what could this look like and what is missing? What planners refer to as the missing middle. These are types of housing that they were common before zoning became common, and they're multifamily homes that are at a scale that sort of fits more seamlessly with a single family neighborhood. Sort of low to medium density, if you want to think of it in those terms. So go back to these requirements going back to the requirements I mentioned earlier. Take a look at these features above. What if you could weigh each of these things and whatever else is important to you more individually and weigh their costs and what trade-offs that you wanted? There's a lot of people who choose single family homes because of just one feature. And missing middle offers the opportunity that maybe you can trade off on a couple of these, still get most of the benefits that you want for something a lot more affordable. The problem is that a lot of missing middle housing types, we have a very low supply, partly because of zoning. For one thing, most of them are outlawed in single family home areas, but a lot of them actually don't really fit into the multifamily zone requirements either. And oftentimes missing middle housing is developed at a smaller scale. So we're not talking about a giant complex with a big wealthy developer. We're talking about a mom and pop who converts their house to a duplex. People who don't have the lawyers or the expertise or the experience for the rezoning that it might take for a big project. So here's a couple examples of missing middle housing. I like duplexes because it keeps most of the benefits of a house, and you share a wall with somebody, but you can have a smaller unit and a yard and a carport. And this particular one is where my sister used to live with a good friend of ours right next door. It's kind of like friends. Here's a more traditional apartment. but it's smaller than you might typically see, and it's not gated, and it has a very community feel. Things like townhomes and row houses are also missing middle. My personal favorite is small home villages. And this is where maybe you really don't want to share walls with people for privacy reasons or for sound or whatever. So you can have your own freestanding house. So these ones are 600 square feet, and share a yard with 10 other units or 5 other units. And you get this great small scale sense of community with lots of those benefits of having a single family, a home at a fraction of the cost. There's the inside. Slade and I went on a little field trip. This is Tempe Micro Estates in Tempe. And look, he's so happy with his floppy hat, and it's so adorable in there. But tiny home villages are illegal in most cities, in most zoning districts, because they just don't really fit into our existing template. For example, in Phoenix, a single family home is defined as being on its own lot with a yard in between. And multifamily dwellings include only structures that are attached to each other. So it doesn't really fit into, some of these innovative solutions don't fit into our existing rules. Similarly, I think this casita is adorable. It's just one casita with 2 studio apartments that have their own bathroom but share a kitchen. I don't cook, and I could see where I might choose one of these over a similarly priced apartment or other option. So some of these have great curb appeal. They tend to be integrated into the neighborhood. Slade will talk later about requirements for things like walls and gates, but a lot of multi-family housing districts require a wall around them. And you can see that all the examples that I gave are not gated communities. And so that gives it more of a integration with single family neighborhoods. So we need to increase our supply of missing middle to help the market be more flexibility and meet more people's needs. But there's one particular type of missing middle housing that has so much promise that we want to talk about it on its own. And that is what you might commonly hear referred to as a guest house.
So we're talking about accessory dwelling units here. These are freestanding guest houses or granny flats that are on the same lot as a house. So they have their own kitchen and bathroom and their own independent entrance, and they're basically their own independent living unit. So ADUs have a lot of benefits. One, they can let an aging parent live near their adult child and get the benefits of support and companionship without the privacy sacrifice that would come with moving into the adult child's household. This arrangement also keeps the aging parent the head of their own household, which is usually what they are accustomed to throughout their adult life. And it's what they prefer. 88% of elderly adults who live in their own home or apartment want to keep it that way. The aging parent can also support the child by paying rent, taking care of pets and children, watching the home during vacations and so forth. The same support they could do for the child if they lived in the household. And this support helps keep the aging adult with a sense of value and purpose. ADUs can also be useful for people who aren't yet elderly as a planning tool for their senior years. They can build the ADU at their home while they're younger with the idea of moving into it someday as they age. And the ADU can be built with features that make it accessible for an elderly person. So right now, and we're hoping that this may change soon, but right now, guest houses are prohibited in most of Phoenix. Most single-family residential zone types prohibit them in Phoenix. And the zone types that permit them are are zones with big minimum lot sizes, big houses. And these zones are pretty much exclusively in expensive areas, such as next to Camelback Mountain. Most Phoenix homeowners, in other words, are in zones where they can't build one of these. Granny flats, same thing. These are allowed where the guest houses are allowed and in a few more neighborhoods that are exclusively on the far north or southwest sides of town. But again, they're not allowed for most homeowners in Phoenix.
And even if you're lucky enough to live somewhere where they're allowed and have a guest house, there's oftentimes a lot of other restrictions in place. For example, in Phoenix, there's a ban on advertising them for rent. So you can have your cousin move into one and pay you for it, but you can't list it on Zillow to make that available on the market. And you can't convert your single family home into a duplex or another missing middle type either. That's also not allowed.
And you can't use zoning procedures such as variances and rezoning to do it. Variances, these are just formal exceptions to zoning restrictions that you can apply for, but they generally won't work because the reason for variances generally must relate to the land for them to be approved. And the reason you want an ADU is because you want it for yourself or for your aging parent. The reason is personal to you, not to the land specifically. And also, rezoning won't work because it's a complicated and expensive process, extensive application, fees, hearing processes. It's not designed for individual homeowners just making a modest change to a single lot. Now, you can try it, but if you want to do it, good luck to you. We're not zoning attorneys, so we're not here to help you for that. Now, it's a shame that most homeowners can't add an ADU because the benefits they have aren't just theoretical. There is high demand for ADUs where they're legal. Homes that have ADUs where they're legal tend to command premium prices. New home builders build them into many new homes because people want them. Another benefit of ADUs is to government. So aging adults tend to need increasing support as they age, obviously. And right now, government pays for a lot of that support. For example, Medicaid pays for about half of all the long-term care for the nursing home care for the elderly. Legalized ADUs would likely lead more aging adults to live alongside their adult children. And whatever support for the aging adult the child supplies, that's support that the government doesn't have to supply.
Let's switch gears and talk about walkability. Let's take Granny for a walk. We've used the term walkability a lot, but so that it's not just a buzzword, let's talk about some of the characteristics that make a neighborhood walkable. Remember that 1/3 of the population can't drive, and this is important for reasons of autonomy and transportation and health.
So, I mean, this looks like a place we'd call walkable. There's a nice place for Granny to walk, pedestrian path. Looks like there's some shade there. She's not exposed to car traffic. It's aesthetically pleasing. Looks like a pretty nice place.
Well, unfortunately, Granny doesn't live there. Granny lives here. Just feel it. You can see from this picture that this is not a place where you would want to walk, but why is that?
Well, I mean, let's look at the details here. First of all, we've got this wall that's separating Granny from where she lives over in the housing over on the left there. She had to walk a long way to get around that wall. Also, look at how unpleasing to the eye this path she is. It's unchanging scenery along here. There's car noise and exhaust from the cars. no smiling people along here. She's going to have to go a long way up to that crosswalk to cross the street. And by the way, that intersection is very dangerous for her because she moves slower now, and she can't move out of the way of hazards as quickly, and she's not as perceptive as she used to be to notice hazards that are coming at her. And arterial intersections are a notoriously dangerous place for pedestrians. Many people die each year from being hit in a crosswalk by a car that just doesn't see them. So we would call this area unwalkable here.
You know, Slade, I get the impression that a lot of people think that it's just bad luck for Granny that we decided to build this way and that this is where she lives. But zoning actually requires a lot of the features of unwalkability. And that includes things that might be obvious, like commercial zones being separated and far away from residential, so the destinations are far away, but also things that are maybe less obvious. For example, take a look at that wall. It looks pretty dreary. Now go ahead and read this zoning ordinance.
So what this ordinance requires is for residential developers to build a wall between their residential developments and an adjacent undeveloped property of a different zone type. What this essentially does, and other similar provisions that require other developers to build walls, it essentially, this provision requires the developer to turn their residential neighborhood into a fortress, where the only way out is along a few streets. Now, residents may appreciate this buffer that keeps noise and outsiders out. It comes at a cost. Residents may want to go to a grocery store that's just a few hundred yards away from their house, but that short distance as the crow flies may become a mile or more because of this kind of barrier.
And that idea of it increasing the distance is not just hypothetical. Let's take a look at a real situation. Let's say that Granny she's lucky enough to live in one of these wealthy areas that allows ADUs. And this is a real house. And she loves her afternoon latte. So here's her house on a map, and here's the cafe that she's trying to get to. It's super close, 357 feet to be exact. And maybe you add a little for the crosswalk, but all in all, it's a short walk. It should be 4 minutes. But look what's between Granny and her latte. The whole subdivision is walled off. So Slade and I actually went on a little field trip to inspect this wall, and there is no break in the wall, no shortcuts for blocks. So when you map out the route that she actually has to go to get around the wall, it turns that walk into one that is 15 times longer, a mile in each direction to be precise. And we know that most people of any age are only willing to walk half a mile in total. So that right there makes it so that it's just unviable to walk there. Now let's imagine that Granny lives here with a nice park and walking path right behind her house. Isn't that nice? She could take the walking path and maybe she wouldn't have to cross the street in dangerous places. Well, there's actually a wall that blocks off all of these houses from the walking path. So she would have to walk way out of her way just to get to it and can't really use it for transportation. And in contrast, this is what it could look like this is a apartment that opens right up onto a walking path that actually goes underneath arterials straight to restaurants and other destinations, providing a beautiful, safe space. And it's a lot more walkable when you don't wall the neighborhood off from it.
Yeah, by the way, the wall in that video, the video cut off short for some reason. The flyover would have gone on and on and on, and that wall, there was a solid wall for quite a long distance there on that previous slide.
And there's nothing to stop developers from building gated communities when people demand it. But when we mandate it by law, then we're forcing the hands of consumers and developers.
So I want to end here by briefly talking about the Phoenix Walkable Urban Code. They adopted this in 2015, and it allows for development of dense mixed-use communities along Phoenix's major mass transit corridors. And there's lots of requirements in it aimed at improving walkability, such as shade requirements for pedestrian paths in developments, bike infrastructure, and many, many others. Unfortunately, it's not been a game changer, and we don't see it being a game changer. For one thing, you can only apply for it if you are along these light rail corridors, and even in those corridors, it doesn't apply automatically. So a developer has to apply for it just like any other zoning change, and that's complicated and costly, and only a few scattered parcels have rezoned as walkable urban in the eight odd years it's existed. And even if it was expanded, as the city is considering to expand it over the whole city, it still wouldn't be a game changer without modifications, because again, we think it would just be adopted in scattered parcels.
So we've got lots of ideas in terms of policy recommendations, but we want to leave you with some simple takeaways. First of all, we recommend that at least some zoning reform be done through state legislation that puts limits on what cities are allowed to restrict through zoning. And I'll try to avoid getting too technical, but this is for a couple of reasons. One is that there's just a lot of different cities in any given state. And so it's hard for change to happen when you're relying on going city by city rather than doing it all at once. Another reason is that the main constituency for opposing some of these changes are a vocal minority of local residents, oftentimes people refer to as NIMBYs. And those folks are are more of a citywide than a statewide constituency. So doing it at the state level has more support. And in many states, there's been bipartisan support for zoning reform from developers and also from people who want affordable housing, from coalitions of folks who you might not necessarily typically think would work together. It also could, in some cases, be good political cover for cities when they're not having to make these decisions at the city level. But it's something that's done at the state level, then they get less blowback from distressed homeowners who don't want things in their neighborhoods. So in terms of what should be included in reforms, we're just talking about a couple of very narrow, kind of low-hanging fruit today. And we'll leave broader reform to a bigger discussion later. But first of all, we think we should legalize ADUs. At all levels of government, there's actually less opposition to this, probably because it has a connotation of being associated with wealthier homeowners. And it also brings affordable housing types to those single-family neighborhoods, which, remember, are in the more desirable areas. So we're building more affordable housing units there. And we also need to get rid of some of these restrictions that go along with ADUs, like the advertising ban that I mentioned, because if you already have an ADU and can't rent it out, it doesn't serve its purpose to the full extent. And other states have done it. California legalized ADUs in 2017, and then in 2020 they came in and legalized it for everyone to have 2 ADUs statewide. And there's at least preliminary evidence that it could actually meaningfully impact the housing supply. In Los Angeles, for example, there were 80 permits for ADUs in 2016, and in 2019 there were over 6,700. Another place of reform that we recommend is relaxing some of these other housing requirements, like the minimum lot sizes and that sort of thing. And then we'd like to see some changes for walkability. And the wall requirement is one of many possibilities that we just chose as an example, not even necessarily the most important one, but we really need to be looking at our zoning ordinances with a fine-tooth comb, trying to see, are they really meeting our needs, and what are these unintended consequences? And that's a good place to stop with another plug for the Housing Coalition's conference with Nolan Gray, because in his book, he makes a very articulate case for what broader reform could look like. And I'm very excited for that discussion.
And by the way, we know that zoning reform will address affordable housing only slowly and very incompletely, and that it can only be like part of a many pronged approach to curing affordable housing, which is in many cases an acute problem that requires more immediate action.
Absolutely.
Kirin, Slade, thanks so much. We are moving into the discussion portion of our webinar, and there's been an active chat, a really good discussion going on. I have a question that I'd like to pose that came from the chat, but I also want to give kudos to William, who is representing City of Douglas and putting a lot of good information in the chat. And William, if you are willing, after this question, I'd love to bring you on to talk about international building codes, because I think that's an important part of this conversation. But I don't want to put you on the spot without your permission. So in the interim, the question from Isaac is about height. It seems like the taller the buildings, the more expensive the cost to live there. Is there an optimal height for high density developments?
Oh, wow. That question is beyond my level of knowledge. We're both public health lawyers and not super acutely aware of the real estate market. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I've never come across anything talking about that. So I don't know. I don't know an answer to that question.
I do know that oftentimes the taller buildings are expensive for developers to build, so that could have some correlation.
Okay. So I would like to open it up. William is saying, I've heard a sweet spot is 4 stories. So William, I'm going to give you the opportunity to come on screen with us. You do not necessarily have to turn on your camera, but would love to have some input from Douglas. It's just great to have statewide representation here.
Did he freeze or did I freeze?
He may just still be coming on.
Yeah, I see his name up there twice and one of them's muted. Not sure.
While we are working to bring William into the conversation, we'll go back to some of the questions that came in while you were presenting. So you talked a little bit about heat islands, and there was a question about that. Would you like to talk a little bit more about the effect of heat islands on health?
Okay, Phoenix is obviously a very hot city, and in particular, it's hot. There's some heat waves during the summer, and the temperature is tending to get hotter over time in Phoenix. So these hot spikes are getting hotter and hotter, and that's when large numbers of people are dying in Phoenix during these hot spikes. Now it's when I showed that graph earlier about how many more deaths there are now than there was 20 years ago in the Phoenix metro. The heat is not the only cause of that. There's a lot more homeless people who don't have any shelter now. That's a contributor to it. There's also a severe drug addiction problem that we have that makes people more vulnerable to the heat. That's also a contributor to it. But the fact is the fact that Phoenix is tending to get hotter over time is a huge contributor to heat-associated deaths. And it's not just people who are outside exposed to the heat. It's also people who are inside, who their air conditioning breaks down or they simply can't afford it. And housing affordability plays into that because as people are more economically stressed, they can't afford to fix their air conditioners or they can't afford to run it. And that at the same time, we've got an increasing elderly population in particular. So in the metro, there's just more elderly people, and that's also means we have more people who are particularly vulnerable to heat because they are elderly. So
also, the heat island gets worse the more pavement that we have and the less trees and vegetation. And Phoenix has a fairly low tree shade canopy. So one thing, not really in the scope of this presentation, but that Slade and I have discussed with each other is whether zoning can be a tool to increase shade canopies and kind of offset some of the externalities of that pavement by requiring vegetation or trees. So that's another separate interesting issue.
Yeah. And the thing about pavement is that it absorbs sunlight and releases heat. So any surface like that will do the same. And some have proposed putting solar panels over parking lots, and that may not be a good solution for heat, because solar panels also are another type of surface that absorbs light, and while they turn some of that light energy into electricity, a lot of it they're returning that as heat. So there's some inconsistent research on that. It's not conclusive yet, but at any rate, the problem with a place like Phoenix is that it has so much of the city is covered by these surfaces that are taking in all the sunlight that we get here and are releasing it, particularly at night, as heat. So
how are we doing with William?
William is having some microphone difficulty, so we continue to work on that. But I'd like to go back to his original question from early on in the session and just read it so that at least we get the content out there. Zoning isn't the sole issue with affordability. International building codes are silent and phantom barriers to building innovative and affordable housing. And largely, building officials don't have the same transparency requirements that planning and zoning officials have with public policy. A zoning code can be amended without any contact with building codes that require height limits, setback distances greater than desired for an urban walkable district.
That's a great point. That doesn't surprise me at all. I'm a little bit familiar with building codes, actually mostly in the area of air quality. So I don't know that I have more to add than William did, but I think that's a very good point.
Yeah, and the thing about it is, zoning is something that it's not something that's, because so much is already built out, it's not something that we expect in most cases is going to change the environment immediately. A lot of the benefit in making zoning reforms is to stop digging, for example, in terms of walling off residential neighborhoods, for just one example, just to stop digging on the new stuff that we're building, so that at least developers have choice in the new developments that they are building, and aren't forced to wall them off. And then, over time, there will be some redevelopment in areas that are already developed, and then the better provisions from a public health perspective can apply to those new developments. And so, I mean, yeah, this is like I say, this is not zoning reform is not a cure-all, but the nice thing about ADUs is that I think that will be a particular zoning reform that'll move a little bit faster. So because people, I mean, they think there is some pent-up demand for that, people will within months, years, or even months might apply for permits to build new ADUs. So that's an attractive zoning reform for that reason.
William may be joining us. He's working on his technical difficulties. I'm going to give him a chance to speak up if he is able to. But I also have another question that I would like to pose while he's working. And this comes from Jessica. To what extent is the lack of public transportation, there is even assault on funding it now in our state legislature, a factor in the lack of housing for the elderly in auto-centric Phoenix? So to what extent is the lack of public transportation a factor for lack of housing for the elderly?
Well, I can, oh, go ahead, Kirin.
Well, one issue is, I forget the exact level of density, but there's a sort of threshold density that you need for public transportation to be really viable and convenient. And obviously a lot of Phoenix is very low density. And so I think that has an impact on how much public transportation is really viable, even if we do invest a lot. I don't know if that gets to the heart of her question.
I was going to say the same thing, and I don't think that I think it may not directly answer the question, because we kind of come at it from the opposite perspective. Is that things like ADU reform, they would create more housing units per square mile. That's
closer to that threshold density to make public transport viable.
Plus missing middle houses, same thing. Missing middle housing is same thing. These things are denser types of houses, and the more dense your population is, the more people that are close to your transit stops. So and your transit stop, you need some critical mass of people, of ridership, to make those projects viable. So once you have I think this is attractive. These kinds of reforms are attractive from that perspective, is that they tend to make your community have a denser population, and then your transit projects become viable. You have better mass transit, then more people ride it, and then you're getting all the benefits from that. Then maybe you can eliminate some parking spots because less people are driving, and you can have less asphalt that way. Maybe you don't need as many roads. I mean, we see a lot of long-term benefits from density.
Also, too, though, even in the places that have the best transportation, public transportation, you have the last half mile problem. So you still need to be able to, if you are close enough to a transit stop, have that be a walkable, pleasant, community-oriented space that a person is going to want to go. I tried to take public transportation the other day just because I was like curious how long it would take. And I typed where I was going into Google. It literally told me to drive to a bus stop. I thought it was really funny.
Oh, we got William here. I was just going to say one more thing about the transit is, the closer the more walkable it is for the elderly person to get to the transit stop. That helps the social isolation problem, because now if that elderly person can walk to the transit stop, that opens up a lot of other places they can go to when they're a non-driver. So.
It all sounds great. This is Will from Douglas, Arizona. I'm off site today, but I'm really happy that you are having this discussion. It's really important because I think that the idea of increasing the availability of affordable housing is so very important. But I think what I'm seeing, at least at the state level with the legislation that's recently been put out there, is that it's putting local control over zoning, and not necessarily just the zoning part, but the development standards and what the product may look like. It kind of puts that aside, and I'm a little bit concerned about that. But at the same time, Douglas is a community that, compared to most other places in the state, is not very well to do in terms of demographic income and all that, but our real estate prices and our rental prices are really rocketing quickly, along with Bisbee, which is a community that's 25 miles to our west by northwest. We're right at the border with Agua Prieta and Sonora, but we have a large population of folks who work for Customs and Border Protection. And the increase in staffing there has really seen the available land supply for housing just shrink really quickly. So we're definitely interested in this, but we're already pursuing on our own a number of zoning amendments, zoning code text amendments to address that. And so I'm a little bit concerned that the state is going to kind of step over local controls where we're trying to provide those options ourselves, that actually are suited to our community. But I definitely still think that the discussion about accessory dwelling units and about providing more affordable housing is really important, because there are some communities in Arizona that probably aren't really thinking about this. But in Douglas, we are. So just wanted to state that, let you know. And so, yeah, again, building codes, those are things that aren't really even really discussed and not really even considered, that even supersede zoning in many ways on issues that really are zoning issues: setbacks, building separations, and uses and square footages, and all the things that we kind of assume are all just about planning and zoning. So we'll take the hits. I'll put my helmet on and I'll take the hits, but it's going to be the building code that really prevents a lot of what we're talking about here with affordable housing.
That's a really good point. And correct me if I'm wrong, William. My understanding of building codes is that typically there's the model code, the International Building Code, that cities just adopt for the most part. And so it's actually not typically decided on at the local level, even if it is in the sense that they adopt the code, but the individual cities don't pick and choose individual provisions too much. Is my understanding of that process correct?
You're generally correct. A city can, if it is really conversant in what the codes say, whatever code they've adopted for building codes, whether it's electrical code, plumbing code, residential code, there's several different codes. You can adopt amendments or provide warrants, I believe they're called, that are more specific to your jurisdiction. But for the most part, those aren't even really questioned. Most people really look at the zoning code, which is for myself, what I'm generally responsible for. But I know from practice for over 20 years that it really comes down to what does actually the building code say? And so you can talk about like, hey, we want to encourage high density mixed use in our downtown or in our particular neighborhood district that's going to be more walkable. But the building codes will say something that's different. And if there's nothing that's been changed with those, then you still have the opportunity for a building official to say, hey, this is what the building code says, and I'm not going to put myself and my license on the line to allow this, which you say you want to do, because it doesn't fit with what the building code says. And that's always like, as a planner, I'm looking at it and say, wow, man, this is really some heavy stuff. But it's the reality is that there's some professions, even within, bureaucracy and governance, that get deference and people aren't really looking at, here are all of the pieces. Here are all of the deflector shields. Here are all of the little challenges that you may have with actually getting projects done that support walkability, that support increased residential density, that increase the opportunity for people to mingle together and all this. Is that the zoning code is only one piece of it. And if the legislature is only focusing on that and they're not focusing on building codes, which are generally associated with insurance, with finance and all these other things, is that we have a challenge ahead that, okay, so we've thrown out zoning and said that zoning is, you can't do any zoning when it comes to residential development, is you're still going to have building codes that kind of provide with the controls that aren't really, again, talked about or discussed. So
that's a really good point. And William, if you email me, I would love to have a individual conversation to chat with you about some specifics of what we could look into for how building codes fit into this sort of thing.
Yeah, because every jurisdiction, our jurisdiction in Douglas, we actually have adopted the 2006 International Building Codes family. Other jurisdictions, maybe Sierra Vista might be in the 2012 or possibly the 2015 or maybe even later. But there are other jurisdictions that I know that have adopted the 2018 building code. And there's differences in them that kind of tie in maybe a little bit to the economics of the community, because the building codes have maybe some differences in the actual, bricks, mortar, wood, nails, screws, all that stuff, but they also have calculations of building valuation, like how you're actually going to cost a project. The 2006 code is more appropriate for Douglas because Douglas is not Phoenix. It's not Tucson. Our economics and the income level for people here is a lot different than in those places. So our income levels are lower. Our contractors make less. Our material costs might be as much for those projects to get built, but our codes kind of reflect what our community can afford. That may change, but that's in the international building codes. They have different calculations for a project of what that project's going to be worth and what the permit costs for that project should be that the city would charge. And so William, that's another. Yes.
William, I need to break in here for a moment just to make sure that we stay on time, because I want to announce that we are at the end of our scheduled time, but Kirin and Slade are willing to stay for some informal discussion. So I want the conversation to continue in just a moment here. But I do want to say thank you to Kirin and Slade, obviously. Thank you so much for the expertise that you shared with us today. And thank you for everyone who joined us and kept the conversation going via chat, as well as online in person. And toward that end, I am going to turn the recording off, but invite anyone who wants to stay and continue to talk to do so. And we can have more folks come online, just like William did, to be part of a verbal conversation. So just raise your hand if you want to be part of that.